Today's News Talk Radio.
I do a lot of streaming radio.
I do a lot of free streaming.
TNTRadio.live.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. I am your host, Patrick Henningsen. This is the second hour of this live broadcast. We are live and direct on all platforms, video and audio. Do pick up the TNT Radio app, as you just saw in the advert during the break. You can listen at your leisure wherever you are, iPhone, Android. Go to the App Store, go to the Google Play Store, download it. You can be there all the time. It's a great chat facility as well. You can access all that through the TNT Radio app. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to move over to a big story. This is actually kind of broke overnight. And our next guest, I want to get his comment on this and so many other important things that are developing right now with regards to the Middle East, especially Sam Husseini. He's an independent journalist. He's also a correspondent at the State Department in Washington, D.C. Sam, big news overnight, or is it big news? UN Security Council ceasefire resolution. Looking at the text of this, it sounds very familiar, this deal, Sam. This is passed. And the question is it good enough for Israel? Will Hamas agree to it? Or what are we looking at here?
I think what we're really looking at is the U.S. co-opting this international law and the Security Council process. If Israel and Hamas want to have a deal brokered by the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt to have a ceasefire, they can do that. Why the hell does this have to go through the Security Council? I'll tell you why the U.S. wanted it to go through the Security Council, because what was supposed to happen was that the ICJ on the 24th of May issued clear orders that the Israeli invasion of Rafah must cease, and the U.S. didn't want that to happen. They want to give Israel a green light to continue. So they plugged into and the Algerian. What should have happened is the ICJ is a court. It issues orders, and then the court orders are turned over to the sheriff, which implements those orders. In this case, the sheriff is supposed to be the UN Security Council, and the Algerians apparently had a resolution lined up to implement the orders of the World Court. U.S. wanted to sabotage that process, and it succeeded in doing so, with Biden's by first threatening to veto the Algerian resolution, making them hesitate and start to water it down to try to make it so that the U.S. wouldn't veto it. And then on the 31st of May, Biden goes to the microphone and says, "Oh, we got a ceasefire thing that Israel has put forward," which is actually very similar to something that Hamas had accepted like a month earlier. Although the U.S. claimed that at the time that Hamas didn't accept it. And now the U.S. is claiming that Hamas did accept it. So, look, the U.S. is just, people are trying to make, coherent sense of the U.S. position. There is no coherent sense of the U.S. position. They are a player on a baseball field that is kicking up sand in order to muddle the issue so that clear law is not implemented. They don't want a UN Security Council implementing the orders of the World Court. That is their nightmare. Their nightmare is clear legal process to end this war. And they are doing everything in their power in concert with Israel, in spite of all the noise, in spite of all of the hubbub, in spite of all of the alleged, Biden and Netanyahu that we've heard a million times over the last several months. That's all pretense and garbage. They are effectively working in concert to sabotage international law and to ensure that there's not a peaceful resolution to this. Now, everybody's buying into this process that the U.S. fundamentally controls. It's very much like a microcosm of what the U.S. did with the Oslo process, right? Back in the 80s, there was this legal framework of UN Security Council resolutions and so on that was supposed to guide a process to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli dispute, as it's called. And then there was the Madrid Conference. After the first Gulf War. That was sort of the token payoff to the Arabs for going along with the pummeling of Iraq in 1991. So in 1993, they got this, in 1991, they got this, Madrid news conference that was based on international law. And you had people like Haider Abdel Chafi, a respected figure from Gaza, participate in that. And then the U.S. and Israel go behind, in the back door, set up this process in Oslo. Arafat signs on to it, and it's all smoke and mirrors, and it promises you things that you'll get down the lines that you never get. And so they've kind of done the same thing here, except now they're apparently doing it with Hamas.
So if such a thing was implemented, let's say, Algeria's effort was successful, what would that mean? I mean, wouldn't the solution be UN peacekeepers controlling the Rafah border crossing, allowing aid through? I mean, wouldn't that be one of the solutions?
Right. Now, if the Algerians put forward a proper UN Security Council resolution, the U.S. would, in all probability, veto it, and then there would have been global furor at your vetoing this UN resolution that has wide support, that is based on a world court decision, and what the hell? And what you could then have seen, and I wrote a piece on this the very day that a couple of hours before Biden put forward his phony thing on the 31st of May, I put forward an in-depth piece about what would then happen, and that is called Uniting for Peace. If the UN Security Council is unwilling or unable to live up to its responsibility to ensure global peace and security, then the General Assembly can seize control of the matter, and with 2/3 majority, start to implement things. That could include sanctions against Israel. It could certainly include an arms embargo. It could include suspension of Israel from participating in the General Assembly. It could admit Palestine as a full voting member, and it could mean a force of some sort. The main precedent for this was 1956. In 1956, you had Israel, along with Britain and France, invade Egypt and take Gaza at the time. The U.S. and the Soviet Union said, no, you're not. And they used Uniting for Peace in the General Assembly to reverse that invasion, because, of course, Britain and France had a veto in the Security Council. So the Security Council couldn't do its job because of their veto, just like now it can't do its job because of the U.S. veto. And they forced Britain and France out. And it took like another 6 months or so, but eventually they forced Israel out of Gaza. So there is a clear precedent for using Uniting for Peace. This was the first use of a UN military force, and it was a very proper and excellent use of a UN military force. Something like that could be implemented. So it's a matter of other countries stepping up, and make, everybody talks about a multilateral world and so on. Well, I'm not seeing it. U.S. is doing exactly what it goddamn wants. Israel's doing exactly what it goddamn wants. And thus far, we have not seen, the Russians abstained yesterday, and they made a decent statement, a little more tepid, frankly, than I had expected from them. The Russians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, who are totally excluded from the process. South Africa is now, unfortunately, in a bad state because the ANC lost, and they're trying to form a coalition government. And I don't know if them, bringing forward the case at the ICJ was detrimental to their own political interests. I don't know what the dynamic. They were already allegedly in trouble. The ANC was, because they haven't delivered enough economically. But I don't know if that helped or hurt them bringing forward the ICJ case against Israel. But lots of other countries, so-called middle powers and other countries, should be stepping up here. Algeria, most certainly, they voted for the thing yesterday. And they all made these perfunctory remarks about, well, we want the implementation of the ICJ orders, and we want international law, and so on and so forth. But they just voted for a resolution that contained none of that. So it's a very much, look, I don't know if they want the U.S. to fall flat on its face over the next week and then put forward a serious resolution. But it's not looking like that. It looks like everybody's rolling over for the United States, and it's an incredibly insidious process.
The other thing that this was conveniently used to completely paper over was this horrendous scene over the weekend with Israel's ham-fisted hostage, rescue operation that just accidentally killed 274 Palestinians and wounding hundreds of others. And that the United States directly involved in that military operation, at least by using this humanitarian pier as the launching pad for it, and at the most, possibly U.S. Special Forces involved in the op. But I mean, the whole point is this is, the United States directly implicated in war crimes potentially here with this incident. Very serious incident. I mean, this incident alone should trigger an emergency meeting at the UN Security Council under normal global conditions. I mean, it's just horrendous what's happening. Instead, they're celebrating this was a successful operation in Tel Aviv and Washington, but also very embarrassing because the mainstream press, looking at the Washington Post, the New York Times are reporting on this. They're starting to say, actually, this was really reckless. So, I mean, is there a political price to be paid for any of this? And is that one of the motivations for this UN Security Council resolution, to deflect from some of these other embarrassing scenes, Sam?
Well, it certainly on its own, as you say, should have been the cause for a UN Security Council meeting. And to address that, I do think that it was a very calculated effort by Israel, and I don't know what level the calculation was, but part of the calculation, I think, was to make the concept of rescuing hostages and Palestinian carnage together, as if there's a trade-off between the two. As insidious as it is to say, oh, it's worth 300 Palestinian lives to get 4 Israeli hostages. That's insidious enough as it is, but just simply putting forward that notion that they are actually trying to get the hostages, when if they, wanted to get the Israeli captives out, they would have, they would have partaken in good faith negotiations from the very beginning. And I don't know if there's, if the timing of the operation, Israel times things in very shrewd ways. People might recall that back in January, when the ICJ issued its first order, for South Africa, saying that they agreed that the South African case should proceed, and ordered Israel to stop all genocidal acts. Right then is when Israel put out all the disinformation to pummel UNRWA. Mm-hmm. So Israel responds to the possibility of international law by the most insidious, brazen, and violent tactics. And so we see that here. We knew that this UN Security Council resolution was coming up. The U.S. had been demanding that it get to a vote on Monday or Tuesday. And so Israel knew that that was happening. And then with the United States, launched this operation, so there could be a connection there. And as you say, apparently there are many reports of direct U.S. military participation in this, with this pier that many people called out at the time, that it wasn't a humanitarian pier. It was, at best, a PR stunt to draw attention away from the fact that Israel was destroying the Rafah crossing and other crossings and other capacity to get humanitarian relief into Gaza. And at worst, that it would be the launching pad for military operations. And worse still than that, we're seeing some reports that the assault was put under humanitarian guise.
Yes.
Further, impeding and endangering, what little humanitarian relief efforts there are. And we just saw the World Food Program now cease its operations because now they feel unsafe, because they are, with some legitimacy by Palestinians, now being seen as, well, are they an actual humanitarian relief operation, or are they a U.S.-Israeli military operation undercover? So the level of insidiousness here by Israel and by the United States government are manifold.
Yeah, I mean, that brings a whole another dimension to, the war crimes violation of the Geneva Conventions, disguised as Palestinians driving an aid truck going into really and killed quite a few people in the process. I mean, it looks like they called in an airstrike to quote, distract or clear the path to allow the exfiltration of this operation, but which, by the way, appears to have killed as many hostages as they rescued. So that kind of cancels out the operation. I mean, Sam, couldn't they have done an exchange with many opportunities to get these hostages out without having any military raids?
Yeah, again, people portray Israel as somehow being irrational because it's not pursuing those straightforward processes to try to get more captives out, to do exchange with Palestinian captives, to agree to a permanent ceasefire, and so on. I don't think it's irrational on the part of the Israelis. I think it's just insidious. They don't want, Israel has this Hannibal directive, which they have implemented in the past, where they kill their own soldiers rather than allow Hamas or any other group to hold them. Because they don't want to be pressured into any quote unquote concessions. They don't want to negotiate. So they apparently used that on October 7th in order to kill Israelis and Israeli Jews to prevent a meaningful process of negotiations. So the Israeli goal is the destruction of Palestinian society. And I think once people understand that, a lot of Israeli actions actually make sense. They seem irrational. They seem contradictory. They're not. They're just lying about what their actual goals are. Their goals are not even the destruction of Hamas necessarily. Although I do think that now we're seeing the U.S. change the goalposts. Right? They said that. They claimed that Israel accepted this ceasefire proposal when there's no evidence that Israel, no real concrete evidence that Israel has agreed to this proposal, but that Hamas must. And then when Hamas issued a statement saying we agree, they suddenly say, we want to hear it from the leadership in Gaza, meaning Sinwar. So they either want him to be forced to make a statement so that they can get a position on him, or they want to use that as a way to undermine him and his stance as this great fighter against Israel and for the Palestinian people. So we're seeing this change, this moving the goalposts, which is a very familiar tactic from the United States. We saw it over and over again in the case of Iraq, for example. Right? The U.S. would say, "We'll lift the sanctions if you agree to allow weapons inspectors in." And Saddam said, "Okay, I'll let weapons inspectors in." "Oh no, you have to pay reparations to Kuwait, and then we'll let the weapons." And there's always another demand, and they'll never get you what they indicated that they would get you if you actually acceded to their initial demand.
Yeah, and over on the Israeli side, continues to have problems, internal problems politically. They're really stretched thin militarily. They're even going to lift this kind of moratorium on Haredi Jews or Orthodox Jews, and reservists are now rebelling in Israel because Israel's still keeping this moratorium on drafting Haredi Jews, that ultra-Orthodox religious Jews that normally are exempt from this military service. So they're really being stretched thin, trying to open up another front against Hezbollah in the north. And all this is to what? To maintain the political viability of this Netanyahu government, this problematic coalition. So they've got that issue internally in Israel. Externally, they're coming under pressure. I don't see how they can turn this around, Sam. Like, there's no good sort of path forward for Israel other than to a negotiated settlement. I mean, that's what it seems to me on paper. I mean, even trying to put myself into the mind of a Israeli military planner or Netanyahu, I don't see any paths out of this other than to a cessation of hostilities, period. But they're not doing it. It seems like it's very concerning, Sam. They're doing everything but that. And that makes you very concerned about what's coming next. Is Israel going to want to escalate to draw in the United States and others? That's the concern a lot of people have. Your thoughts?
It could well be that. Again, Israel's actions seem irrational, but I don't think that they are, once you consider that they are actually succeeding in their goal, which is doing as much damage as possible to Palestinian society. They want to make Gaza as uninhabitable as possible, to cut off humanitarian relief, in the hope that in 3 months there will be such suffering that they will be able to engineer a forced expulsion into Egypt or elsewhere. That is what they want to do. That is, Israel is a settler colonial state. It wants to expand. It wants to gain territory. That is its goal. So I don't think that the Israelis are being irrational. They may be stretched, but they are succeeding by threatening everybody in the region, Hezbollah, Iran, everyone else. Meanwhile, at a global level, the United States is effectively threatening everybody else. That is, Israel, the U.S. has, a way that it can push Russia and Ukraine. It's effectively threatening China with Taiwan. So it has sort of, you can argue about how that war is going in Ukraine for the United States and for Ukraine and so on, but it can cause problems for virtually every other major global player, lest they cross it where its interests are core to it, and where its interests are core to it right now is clearly Gaza. They've put an enormous amount of effort in order to back Israel's slaughter of the Palestinians.
And as the UN continues to dither, partly because of the United States and their efforts to basically, bog down the process, as you rightly described it, Sam, before, the BRICS nations have issued a statement condemning Israel's actions against Palestinians in Gaza, and they're demanding, the BRICS countries, joint statement demanding the implementation of UN General Assembly resolutions and UN Security Council 2720, calling for the unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. And BRICS ministers have also called for the effective implementation of 2728, which calls for an immediate, durable, and sustainable ceasefire. So for the first time, we've seen official concerted statement from the BRICS nations towards, still the UN is the instrument of consensus and, implementation of some of these policies, Sam. But I think this is interesting because before, this isn't an area that BRICS normally weighs in on, but here they are. This is China, Russia, all the BRICS nations. What do you make of this development?
I wasn't aware of that, and thank you for telling me. I think that's a good development. It could be significant if it's followed through in some meaningful ways, either at the General Assembly through ensuring a Uniting for Peace process goes through, or putting forward forceful resolutions at the UN Security Council, forcing a U.S. veto and making clear how it's undermining international law. And I think that the BRICS nations are in a very good position to really put the European states on the spot here, right? Like the Swiss, for example, are supposed to be the upholders of international law and to the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. and Israel are brazenly, effectively arguing that the Geneva Conventions don't apply to the Palestinians. I've questioned the State Department about this repeatedly. It's clear that that's their position. Even though they don't come out and say it, they're incredibly evasive. But if you parse it through, the U.S. does not recognize that the Palestinians are afforded rights under the Geneva Convention. It's insidious. What the BRICS nations could do, for example, in the UN General Assembly, is compel a meeting on that to effectively order Switzerland to call a meeting on the application of the Geneva Conventions to the Palestinians. This is not something the Swiss probably want to do, but they and other Europeans can and should be cornered into a position where they have to effectively choose between their backing of every illegal action that Israel has and outing them as participating in this illegal process. So I think that there are very creative ways that the BRICS nations and others around the world could be using these legal processes to undermine it. And I think that people need to understand that legal processes matter. I mean, the United States has gone to incredible lengths to rig the legal process. They're not doing that for nothing. They know that they've got to try to have some pretense of legality for their actions, and they're doing that, and that the underlying insidiousness of that should be exposed by other states.
In the meantime, let's take a break with TNT, Today's News Talk, and stay with us. We'll be right back.